We have to understand that we are weak. We can do nothing good. Saint John Chrysostom tells us, only the one who thinks of himself as being nothing really understands himself. He knows himself. He who thinks of himself that he is nothing. This is the true knowledge of ourselves. This is the first exercise, so as not to rely on ourselves and to trust ourselves. Second exercise, ask for assistance from God with meek and warm prayer, because this is His gift. And if your desire is to obtain it, you should first plant in yourself the assurance that not only have you no such understanding of yourself, but that you are unable to obtain it without with your own efforts. We are unable to understand, to assume that we are nothing by ourselves. This is a gift from God. That's why you have to pray with meek and warm prayer. Then, boldly standing before God Almighty, in a steadfast belief, in a steadfast belief that from His great compassion, He will give you this understanding of yourself at the right time and in a way that He Himself knows. Do not let the smallest doubt creep in that you will obtain it. You have to be sure that God will give you this gift if you pray properly. So we have to pray so as to obtain this knowledge that we are nothing and we can do nothing good without God. Third exercise, get used to being wary and fearful of your numerous foes, whom you are unable to withstand even for a brief period of time. Be afraid of their considerable experience in warring against us. Demons have a very great experience. For thousands of years, they war against us. And we have to know and to be fearful. Their cleverness and ambushes, their power to take on the guise of angels of light, their innumerable tricks and nets, which they covertly put in the way of your virtuous life, you have to know and to be fearful. So we have great enemies, very clever and with a great experience. So we have to be armored and to be humble so as to have the Holy Grace activated on us, helping us. This is the third exercise, to know our enemies. And fourth exercise, if you fall into sin, immediately realize your weakness and be conscious of it. So every fall is a lesson for us. And we can use our fall so as not to fall again. How? Humbling ourselves, saying to ourselves, look, what are you? What is your power? How easily you have fallen. So immediately when you fall, realize your weakness and be conscious of it. Because God permits you to fall with the aim of making you more conscious of your weak nature. You see, always weak. We are weak. We have to understand, to be conscious of it, so as to pray unceasingly with humility. When you fall, it's a great chance so as to go forward in this knowledge that you are weak and you can do nothing good, but only to sin if God is not with you. God permits you to fall with the aim of making you more conscious of your weak nature, in order that you might thus not only learn to hate yourself, your bad self, but on account of your overwhelming weakness might desire to be scorned by others also. You see, we have to desire to be scorned by others, not to avoid, not to hate others who scorn us, to hate ourselves and to like to be scorned by others. But how can it happen? When we understand and we realize our weakness. Understand that lacking such desire, it is impossible for this helpful self-distrust to be born inside you and to really take root. You see, we have to acquire this self-distrust, no self-trust, as psychologists say, and teachers and pedagogues in the school, or also our parents, because they obey to these teachings of the psychologists, and they try to give to their children this self-trust. But this is a great catastrophe. We have to acquire this helpful self-distrust. And Saint Nicodimos says this is born inside us with the desire of being scorned by others. You see, we have to like to be scorned from the others, to be mocked of the others. This is the cornerstone and start of genuine humility, because it is founded on the understanding through experience of your impotence and undependability. From there, each one of us can see how important is it for someone who wants to share in divine light, to understand himself, and how the mercy of God usually leads the haughty and independent to this understanding by their failures, rightly permitting them to descend into the sin from which they suppose they can defend themselves, in order to make them take note of their weakness and stop them from depending foolishly on themselves in this or anything else. You see, many times we believe that we are capable not to sin. Maybe for the sins of the flesh. I hear people to say, this sin I will never do. Don't say it. This is pride. Because you are pride, may God permit to fall in this sin, so as not to trust yourself and say never. In this, maybe in others I fall, but in this never. Don't say it. We have always not to rely on ourselves and not to be sure of ourselves. We cannot defend ourselves and we cannot do nothing good without God. God, says Saint Nicodimos, permits these people to descend into this sin from which they suppose they can defend themselves, in order to make them take note of their weakness and stop them from depending foolishly on themselves in this or anything else. Don't ever boast of nothing. This means, Saint Nicodimos says, even though very powerful, is not without its risks, and God does not use it always, but only when all other methods we have spoken of, which are more simple and natural, fail to lead one to self-awareness. This is the fourth exercise, the fall. So as to learn to be taught from our fall. This exercise uses God if all the other methods which we have spoken before, which are more simple and natural, fail to lead us to self-awareness. God teaches us. We don't accept. And then He lets us to fall so as to learn humility from the fall. Thus, we were prideful, self-dependence is lacking, helpful failings do not happen. If we are prideful and rely on selves, then we will have falls. God only at this point does He finally let one descend into sin, great or small, in accord with the measure of his haughtiness, pride, and self-dependence. As much you rely on yourself, as more you fall. So if you do fall, move quickly in your mind to meek self-awareness and a dim view of yourself, and beseech God through persistent prayer to grant you a true light in order to understand your worthlessness and to establish a distrust in your heart for fear you again stumble with worse and more damaging sin. I should add that not just when someone falls into a sin, but also when he is disturbed by some misfortune, affliction, or grief, and in particular a worrisome and drawn-out bodily illness, he must perceive that he endures this so as to obtain self-awareness, that is, the understanding of his weakness, and to be humble. Everything bad in quotes happens for this reason, to understand and to obtain this true self-awareness, to understand our weakness and to become humble. Because if we become humble, then God comes, Holy Grace comes. It is spiritual law. That's why our God who loves us give permission to fall when we don't accept the other lessons, which are more simple. for which we spoke before. With this goal, God permits us to be afflicted by all types of temptations from the devil, men, and from our depraved nature. St. Paul perceived this end in the temptations he endured in Asia when he stated, "But we had the death sentence in ourselves, that we should not rely on ourselves, but in God, who raises from the dead." St. Paul had a lot of temptations while he was teaching all the humanity, making thousands of kilometers on foot. And he explains why. So as not to rely, he says, on ourselves, but in God, who raises from the dead. And he said, always, every day I die. He had so great temptations, so as to be always humble and have his trust in God. And I will subjoin something else, St. Nicodimos says. If one wants to understand his infirmity from the experience of his life, he should not necessarily for many days, but just for a single day, note his thoughts, words, and deeds. Just for one day, for a single day. That is to say, what he thought, said, and did. Write down for one day. He will no doubt discover that the majority of his thoughts, speech, and acts were sinful, wrong, silly, and evil. This test will make him know in reality how discordant and feeble he is. And should he desire earnestly to better himself, this knowledge will make him feel how foolhardy it is to believe anything virtuous will come from himself and not to trust in himself. This is the great truth. We have not to trust in ourselves, because then we become cursed, according to the prophet. We have to trust not in ourselves, but in God. Saint Paisios, the Athonite, says, "Let us not have trust in ourselves. Self-confidence is an obstacle to divine grace. When we entrust everything to God, then He is obligated to help us." Obligated in quotes. Trust in God is a great thing. In Proverbs, we read, "A proud man is insolent and hard-hearted. He who has a high opinion of himself is arrogant, brazen, and hard in heart." Self-confidence is our greatest and worst enemy, because it suddenly and mercilessly throws us into the air and leaves us miserable in the streets. When a person has self-confidence, he becomes bound and unable to do anything, or he struggles on his own. Then it is natural that he will be defeated by the enemy or fail, and his ego will be crushed. The good God, many times, very wisely arranges for us to witness both his divine intervention and the failure we experience due to our self-confidence. To believe in oneself comes either from pride or from demonic influence. All these are said from Saint Paisios. And also, he continues, whoever does not trust in God, but builds with worldly imagination and confidence in himself, is building upon rubble and garbage, and sooner or later it will collapse and bring him down, along with those he shelters. When a person does not put God first in everything, but says, I alone will do this, I, with my own strength, will do that, then he ends up falling flat on his face and accomplishing nothing. That's why we never have to say, I do this, I do that. Always we have to say humbly, if it's God's will, with God's help, I will try to do this or that. Let us, St. Paisios says, not have trust in ourselves. If you come to know yourself, you will see that you have nothing of your own and can do nothing without the help of God. If then you understand that whatever good you do is from God, and all the foolish things you do are your own, you will stop trusting in yourself and will be freed from self-confidence. Christ first sought faith in the power of God, and then he performed the miracle. If you believe in the power of God, you will be healed, he said. Not like some mistakenly say today, man has powers, and if he believes in his powers, he can do anything. Doesn't the gospel say believe? So we agree. Yes, Christ said, do you believe? But he meant, do you believe in God? Do you believe that God can do it? Not to believe just somewhere, to some home, to your power, to you, to yourself, or to another person. But he asks if you believe in God. And that if you believe that God can do it. He sought man's assurance that he believed in God, and then he helped. No, now here does the gospel say, nowhere does the gospel say to believe in my own ego, but to believe in God, that God can help me, heal me. But these people twist things and say, man has powers and must believe in himself. To believe in oneself stems either from pride or from demonic influence. Some people say, if you believe that, it will happen. It will. That is belief in themselves. But behind their self is the devil. They make a god of themselves and strip themselves of divine grace. With such theories, they try to deceive the world. One time, Saint Paisios says, I had to get blood drawn. There were 4 female doctors. The first came, struggled, and couldn't find a vine. The second came, same result. The third came, who was even specialized in this, nothing. At that moment, the fourth doctor was passing by. She saw I was being put through trouble and came to try as well. First, she made the sign of the cross and immediately found a vine because she asked for God's help. The others, in some way, had trust only in themselves and they couldn't do what they have to do. I think I have to stop here. We speak about 1 hour about this distrust in ourselves or in others. And now, God's will, we try to reply if there are any questions in all this we have told. This is only the first weapon Saint Nicodemus gives to us, not to trust in ourselves, not to rely in ourselves or in others. Because as Prophet Jeremiah says, we become cursed, we become deprived of Holy Grace. We are empty of God, and without God we can do nothing good. That's the first and very powerful weapon. And to achieve this weapon, this great weapon, not to trust in ourselves, he gave us 4 exercises to remind. The first exercise is to understand our worthlessness and keep in our mind the fact that by ourselves we are unable to do anything which will make us worthy of the kingdom of heaven. The second exercise is to ask for assistance from God with meek and warm prayer, so as to give us this holy gift, to obtain this distrust in ourselves and in others. The third exercise is to be wary and fearful of our numerous foes, whom we are unable to withstand even for a brief period of time. They are powerful, clever, and with a very great experience in the war against us. They also are transformed in angels of light, and very often they deceive us. So we have to be wary and fearful of them, so as to be humble, and always pray, so as God helps us against them. If these 3 exercises fail to help us to obtain this self-distrust, God permits to enter the 4th exercise, which is to fall, to sin, so as to realize through this exercise, through our falls, through our sins, our weakness, and so through our fall to become humble. But we have to try to learn this lesson without falling through the other 3 methods. And of course, not only when we fall, but also when we have any tribulations, any temptations, we have to believe that everything bad in quotes comes to us because we are not humble. We are sinful and trust ourselves. And that's why God permits to have temptations, tribulations, affliction. That was our lesson today. And of course, there are also 3 more weapons we have to use every time, every second. I remind this and I finish. The second weapon is to trust in God. Because if we stop in this first weapon, don't trust in ourselves, we can do nothing. We have to go forward and to trust God. Of course, we have no time to speak for this weapon, maybe another time. The third weapon is always to struggle, not to stop struggling spiritually against our enemies, praying, fasting, having vigil. Be careful in our senses, in our thoughts, in our imagination, so as not to sin. Cultivating the virtues, fulfilling the commandments, forgiving everything, everybody, praying for everybody, forgiving our enemies. All this is a spiritual struggle. And fourth, to pray unceasingly. With these 4 weapons, we can defeat our enemies, our bad old man, the passions, the world, the 3 false loves, love for money, love for vainglory, and love for the desires of the flesh, for the pleasures of the flesh, and to be cleaned and enlightened from the Holy Grace.